Hello, everybody. Happy World Oceans Day. My name is Suzanne Sanger. I'm the Executive Director of the Sunshine Coast Conservation Association. On behalf of the SCCA, Rhizome Up Media, and the Green Film Series, I would like to welcome you all to our 5th annual World Oceans Day event and the 4th talk in our 2022 NEMO Talk series. The SCCA works in the territories of the Squamish, Shishal, Pliamin, Klahoose, and Homolko First Nations. I'm zooming in today from Chekwelp, or Gibsons, in Atkatsum Howe Sound. We are very grateful to the First Nations in this region for stewarding these lands and waters from time immemorial. We honor the reverence that they have always had for nature and their ancestral and eternal connection with these lands and waters. It is in this spirit of connection between all life on our planet that we bring you the World Oceans Day Festival. Every year, people around the world come together to celebrate World Oceans Day. Through the sharing of remarkable feature films and short films, these NEMO talks and in-person events, we hope to celebrate, inspire, and cultivate connection, to raise awareness of the role our oceans play in our everyday lives and their connection with all living things. The NEMO Talk series specifically aims to link up people with local projects, to explore conservation initiatives going on in the region and find ways to bridge and support restoration and conservation research and helping marine resources and habitats on the Sunshine Coast and beyond. Today, we will hear from Nikki Wright of the SeaChange Marine Conservation Society about eelgrass, its role in oxygen production, and the many positives to our world that the seagrass provides. Diane Sanford, our SCCA Marine Liaison and our World Oceans Day Working Group member, is here to introduce Nikki. Diane, over to you.
Good. Thanks very much, Suzanne. I just wanted to say a great big welcome to Nikki. I'm so pleased that you're able to come today and do a presentation for us. It's awesome. Nikki is the Executive Director of SeaChange Marine Conservation Society, as Suzanne said. And yeah, like I say, I'm so pleased that you're joining us today. Nikki has been a colleague, mentor, advisor, and friend of mine for over 2 decades of our eelgrass and shoreline restoration journey together. I just realized that not long ago, that it's been an ongoing and for me a very large learning experience and blossoming of friendship and yeah, and a very joyful journey. It's been a very great journey. Nikki has dedicated much of her life to educating the public on the value of eelgrass to all of our world and to all of us. And I think without much further ado, I'd like to pass over to Nikki. Thank you for coming.
I really appreciate such a warm welcome from both Suzanne and from Diane. And thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. I'm speaking from the traditional territories of the Wasanic people on the Saanich Peninsula in Brentwood Bay. And hopefully there'll be no lawnmowers in the background. All I hear right now is birdsong. Let's keep it that way. Without further ado, I think that I will open up the PowerPoint and we'll start a discussion. I always want to emphasize that everybody's an expert and everybody that's at the table is sharing their knowledge, their experience. And so I never, ever, ever am offended by interruptions. So yeah, I know we've got a presentation and a series of questions, but I love to loosen it up and make it more of a feast and a feasting rather than a lecture. So if there's any questions or I've said something that is unclear, I'm fine with an interruption. I don't know what that does for the recording of this, but that's how I operate.
Can I interrupt and we'll just ask people to put their hands up, and if they want to speak, I can call on them?
Can everybody see this? Great. Okay. No glitches that time. Great. This is a stupendous photograph by Jamie Smith, who is our chief diver and everything extraordinaire. Without the dive team and SeaChange and community members in the Salish Sea, we would not be able to do our work. So every introduction that introduces me as executive director, I'm just the ringleader. It's just the coordination of the community of incredibly impassioned folks that have kept us going since 1998. And what SeaChange does basically is we go to meetings, yes. We go to roundtable meetings, which I love the most. And we do have to write reports and stay in front of the computer way too long. But where the real flipper meets the seafloor is in the actions of restoration and conservation and education within the Salish Sea. So we are very interested and very engaged and very impassioned about nearshore habitats, primarily because people and the natural world of the ocean meet at that intersection. And as you'll see, this theme will come up probably more than once, that I believe, number one, that restoration actually happens internally in our minds. The real restoration is in our spirit, because it is broken with our disconnect with really what supports us. And I'm very, very concerned that if we don't heal that disconnection, we'll continue to do the degradation and the destruction of the very mother that supports us. So that's going to be kind of the theme throughout this presentation, which is kind of a new one for me. I usually just talk about ecology and then restoration, conservation of eelgrass meadows. But when Suzanne approached me, she said, let's talk about oxygen for a change, because we're always talking about carbon. And I think that's a great idea. Let's talk about oxygen and eelgrass meadows in particular. So in our part of the world, in the Salish Sea, when we talk about carbon and we talk about oxygen, we talk about photosynthesis. And most of us know that photosynthesis is done by plants, both in the forest, in the wetlands, in kelp forests, and in eelgrass beds. In other parts of the world, much of carbon storage and photosynthesis and oxygen production is also produced by, I will get into it, but phytoplankton around the world, but also mangrove forests. But we don't have any mangroves on the West Coast. So I just wanted to show this picture as emphasis. Okay, here's a little editorial comment. I think that the conservation community has bought too far into the competitive model of advertising. And so when the stream of funding is popular around blue carbon, we start competing around ecosystems, and that forests and eelgrass are all of a sudden competing for the amount of carbon that is stored in those ecosystems. And I loved what Suzanne said about what the SCCA is all about. It's about connection and about realizing that we're part of, and not a part of, the natural world. And so this whole model of thinking is emphasized with the competition of resources, funding resources, and conservation communities, that we have to compete and make an argument that one ecosystem is more favorable than another. And I, with the audience, thoroughly dispute that. It's part of the way that we're broken. It's part of the way that we disconnect with our natural world, is to think that there's priorities when it's all incredibly intricately connected, and we're only knowing a little part of that story. So this graphic I've shown before, maybe some of you have seen it. I love it because it's, well, number one, it's created by my friends on Gabriel Island, but also it's just a nice depiction of how it is all connected, from the backshore, the coastal forest, the understory underneath those fir and cedar and hemlock trees, down to the back shore and the foreshore and the intertidal zone where the forage fish are spawning into the eelgrass beds and the kelp forest and beyond. And so even though I'm spending most of my speaking time around eelgrass, it's just in the context of this entire circle of life of which we are a part. So I'm going to speak now about oxygen and the oceanic oxygen budget, which is a term that I just started to use because I like it. So we're living in a world of about 21% oxygen, but it wasn't always like that. It was very, very low, and it's the reason why we're able to be on this beautiful green planet of ours and blue planet. But for the first 2 billion years of its life, the oxygen content of the Earth's atmosphere was about 0.001%. And it was the ocean bacteria and plants known as phytoplankton, and then later larger plants on land and both on land and under the ocean, that increased the amount of oxygen that made it possible for us to be viable here. So it all starts with photosynthesis, which is the process by which plants turn carbon dioxide and water into organic matter and oxygen. And we all learned this many years ago. Most of the oxygen produced by the ocean is directly consumed by the microbes and animals that live there. So even though we talk about the budget and thinking, well, there's a common phrase that every second breath we take comes from phytoplankton or the plants and microbes in the ocean, then in fact, most of the oxygen produced in the ocean is consumed by the life that lives there or is buried in the sediment. But that's an incredibly important detail. So again, I'm just going to remind us all that even though every second breath that we take is not really from the phytoplankton in the ocean, it comes from this huge atmospheric bank, if you will, of stored oxygen that was created over hundreds of millions of years. That's how we breathe. But that if we limit the oxygen in the ocean, we're still cutting ourselves off at the knees. And I'll come to that as to why. I'm just leaving this on for a minute so you can finish that piece of writing there. Okay, so we've got the fish, and this picture, many of you may have noticed over the years that I've done these presentations, comes from Porpoise Bay. There's incredibly lush eelgrass beds in Seashell Inlet, as there are in other areas where one would think, if you were looking at land activities, how is that possible with growing development and industrialization? It's an amazing, resilient plant. And our concern is that it not only continue to flourish, but that we replenish it where it once was. Okay, I just said that most of the oxygen that we breathe is from this atmospheric bank in the atmosphere. And that most of the oxygen produced in the ocean is consumed by the life that lives there or buried in the sediments. However, 50% of our primary production of food comes from the ocean. And the volume of low oxygen areas, call them dead zones, is projected to increase by approximately 7% by the year 2100 if our high carbon dioxide emissions continue as they are now. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot, we're cutting ourselves off at the knees. If we think, well, if the oxygen in the ocean is depleted, no problem, we can still breathe in this world, but 50% of our food source will be gone. All right, so how does eelgrass contribute to the oxygen production in the ocean? Well, they have special cells called chloroplasts, and they convert the carbon dioxide and water into biomass, the plant, and oxygen. So many of you have already seen these plants because you've helped with restoration, or you've seen them washed up on the ocean shorelines after a storm. But I'm always very clear that it's really important to show them anyway, because I have learned very early on in my lectures that if I don't show the actual plant, some people don't understand what I'm talking about. So the roots and the rhizomes are incredibly important because they absorb and store nutrients as well as oxygen, and they store carbon as well for long periods of time in the deeper oceans as they migrate out. It's hard to measure that kind of migration of plant matter that stores carbon. So I'm not a true believer of blue carbon in the sense of it is more efficient than terrestrial forests or anything like that, but we do have to recognize that blue carbon is an incredibly important function of marine plants. And these rhizomes also give rise to other shoots. So this is a clonal plant as well as a seeding plant. And in most areas that I've experienced in Salish Sea, the most successful propagation is through clonal spread of rhizomes, which is an underground stem. Are there any questions so far that anybody would like to address? Comments?
I would make a comment before you go. I had never really thought about how much oxygen is in sediments. I think a lot about how when we talk about forests and not disturbing forests, we forget about how much carbon is in soils. And that's a conversation that I'm always having, is reminding people that there's, part of why we don't want to clear cut and really, dig up the soils, is that's part of it too. But I hadn't translated that to the ocean side of things. So you just totally opened my mind.
Yeah, good. That's great. Any other comments, questions, observations? Okay.
There. I'm unmuting for a second, Nikki.
Yes. Yes.
Yesterday during the eelgrass washing, I was seeing a lot of seed.
Yes.
Seed shoots in our washing.
Great. I'm glad you said that. So yesterday was the last eelgrass restoration event that we'll do for a little while because our funding is over with. It's a 5-year project that's just ending. Cotton Bay was the site, correct, for the shoots?
That's right.
Okay. And do you know where the donor plants were coming from?
I think they were coming from an adjacent bed, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I've observed long time ago when I was still a scuba diver, I noticed that in dense beds, there were more propagating shoots or seedlings.
Mm-hmm.
And where there's more room to spread out, then it's more of a clonal reproduction.
Mm.
But it's also the time of year when the light is more available and the temperature is just right for seeds to develop. It's a very fascinating way for the propagation by seed, in that the specialized blade that contains the seeds separates from the mother plant, floats along the surface, and the seeds are then germinated or on the surface where the pollen is, and then it sinks into hopefully the suitable muddy habitat that it requires at the right depth where light can be caught for more photosynthesis. So there's a lot of variables there that can go wrong, but where there's density, where there's very dense beds and there's no underground space for the rhizomes to spread out, is where I personally, as a diver, have noticed more propagating seeds. So the root systems, so oxygenate, as we said, in the sediment and provide hospitable environment for all those underwater critters that we like to enjoy to eat. So this is a very sterilized picture of eelgrass distribution, and it's in all parts of the world except the Antarctica. It is declining rapidly for all kinds of reasons. In our part of the world, the Sailor Sea, I would say, besides dredging and development, one of the major historical reasons and somewhat present day reasons for the decline is log booming activity, but also something that I will address shortly of nutrients entering into the water column. So I just want to give a little review for some of you who've already seen some of my presentations about how important this plant was for local First Nations. Every part of the plant was used either for medicine, food, ceremony, or housing material, cooking. It was a very special plant, and they knew how to propagate it by disturbing the beds. And just like we have other kinds of plants that when are disturbed grow very vigorously, that's what would happen with the eelgrass bed. But I don't say that very often because a person who puts their anchor in an eelgrass bed says, what's the big deal? You just told me that it propagates even faster when disturbed. But we're talking about one tool in one person's hand, cultivating and collecting the plants, not a huge acre disturbing the sediment. I like to call them a natural marine protected area. If we ever come to the day when there's a national marine protected area in the Sailor Sea, one of the rationales for having such an area is it creates a safe haven for juvenile species, fish, crabs, amphipods, many species, including salmon. So it's a protected area by itself because when a meadow is very dense, it protects the prey from active predators. I saw that just recently in Cowichan, where there's many seals sitting on log booms, just waiting for the salmon to come down from the river systems. And so if there's lush habitat there, they have a better protection from birds, marine mammals, and have a better chance of nourishing themselves so that they're more resilient. I'm talking about the salmon, more resilient to the challenges of the open sea. So squid eggs are on the lower right as we face the screen, and that's what Diane was just referring to. On the upper right hand is herring roe, crabs and herons and such. Thousands of species use eelgrass meadows when they're healthy. Now, having said that, many years ago, I worked with Michelle Deacon to survey the eelgrass from Rathtrevor Park all the way up to Englishman River. And we did it with an underwater camera and a boat. And I was extremely curious, this is way back in the early 2000s, why I was not seeing crabs. I was not seeing fish. I was not seeing a lot of species on the blades themselves. And I spoke to somebody who belongs to a nonprofit up there who are kind of regenerating interest in doing another survey. And I said, please look at that, because it started to raise an alarm bell for me that perhaps one of the reasons why I didn't see much life in an otherwise very rich habitat is because we're over harvesting every species I mentioned. So if an eelgrass bed is healthy, we could be looking at that in the temperate zones of the world. We don't, but we could be. And that's how historically it looked like. Many small organisms feeding larger organisms. And so the food web goes from the sediment all the way up to the very top of the blades, preyed upon by geese and brant geese and ducks and all kinds of birds, all the way up to the whales. Not eating eelgrass specifically, but eating, for example, the amphipods in the sediment gray whales will do that in eelgrass beds, or the salmon and other fish that start their lives in this habitat, the whales will eat. So it's an incredibly complex and beautiful world. And I just wanted to mention blue carbon to emphasize that land plants, forests, the understory of forests, prairie grass, all the way down into eelgrass and kelps, sequester carbon, and much of it is stored in the soil. So oxygen and carbon and soils, we kind of neglect to talk about. So incredibly important. I'm going to pause here to see if there's any questions, comments, your own experience that you want to talk about.
I have
anything
a
at all?
question.
Go ahead.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm just looking at the map that you showed from the, the distribution of eelgrass around the planet, and it's. Is there any explanation for the dearth of it in South America? I mean, it looks like the overview shows next to none down there. And then when you look at, equivalent latitudes further east, it seems to be fairly abundant.
I can't speak from knowledge. I'm speaking from intuition. It could be that there are lack of dollars to actually do decent surveys. That's the first thought that comes in. I don't know. But it does take resources to actually go out there and have the equipment and the time to find out how extensive it is.
Right.
But
Although
thank you for that question. It's a very
Yeah,
good perception.
you're probably right. And yet I know, and I'm just thinking out loud here, and yet I know, I mean, if you look in Southeast Africa, which would also be short on resources, it's there.
That's right. That's right. How about, Richard, how about if you could take a few minutes just to Google that question and see what happens? I'm
Alright.
really interested in what is possible about South America.
A job. I like jobs. Thank you.
Okay, go for it. Thank you for that. Okay, this is also the fun part of the presentation, is talk about how we can make a difference. And so it's a beautiful map of the Salish Sea, and it does away with the borders, so you can see the entirety of this gorgeous sea of ours. And the other way I like this map is it shows how many watersheds are actually emptying into this sea that still has so much life, this inland sea. But with all that water that comes down, especially with the atmospheric storms that we're having, comes sediment and all the consequences of our land activities, such as agricultural runoff, fertilizers, and all the contaminants from urban living. So the poor Salish Sea it's getting more than its fair share of contaminants and nutrients affecting the habitats and the fish and the inverts that use those habitats. On the right-hand side, we have a watershed model used primarily by middle school students in the area that I'm living and working in. And the reason I wanted to show it is that both adults and children are very they have not been taught about watersheds and what that concept is, or how any activities that we do on land affects the waterways near which we live. So in this, if you don't know about watersheds, they're just these three-dimensional models that show a local watershed, and then the children place for us sugar crystals on them, which represent pollutants like fertilizers, pesticides, insecticides, and sediment and oil from roads, puts them on the land, and then they pour water over it to see what happens in the waterways. And the bottom is, for me, the Saanich Inlet. and we look at the bucket of water that accumulates from all that quote rain, and it's very, very, very murky, and kids don't want to even look at it, much less think about drinking it. So it's a really good educational model for thinking about everything that we do on land does affect the waterways. And in fact, it's been found that 80% of contamination in waterways comes from the land. Why am I saying that? Because it's one way that we can look at harmful algal blooms that are happening more frequently and a larger scale in the Sailor Sea. First Nations will say, yes, we did have red tides way back in the day. My grandfather, my great-grandfather would refer to them, and they knew not to eat the clamfish, the clams or the oysters. And they also had plants to remedy any kind of toxins that were in the body because they accidentally did consume those shellfish. So red tides have been around for long periods of time, but not on the scale at which they're happening and not the intensity. So the photograph on the lower end there is a red tide in on Salt Spring Island. That's very intense. We call them algal blooms or red tides, but they're now spoken of as harmful algal blooms or HABs. And they're caused by runoff from the land. So what can we do about that? Well, we can be very, very conscious again that we all live in a watershed. We have a watershed address, and that my personal opinion is lawns are a waste of land use. We could get rid of our lawns so that we don't have to fertilize them and mow them when we should be walking in the woods. And be conscious of everything that goes down stormwater drains, and especially septic systems. If we live in areas where we manage our own septic systems to keep them in really good condition, because those nutrients that come from those systems overflow, go into estuaries and bays that usually have very low water circulation. And that's where you will find harmful algal blooms. Not good for us and not good at all for marine life, because it depletes the oxygen in the water. If they can't move out of it, they die. And the other way that we can control the lack of light reaching eelgrass. So that's what I'm trying to address here, is that for photosynthesis to occur, we need light. We also need good sediment, but we need good water quality through which light can travel. And when everybody sets up a dock to connect the land to their house or the water to their house, it's an accumulative effect where the eelgrass beds that could be growing along a continuous, flat, abundant, meadow-like strip could then be interrupted over and over and over again the more those docks are built, until it's so fragmented that it's not a functional meadow supporting all those species of life that's so important for both ocean health and our health. And if people do need to build a dock, then it's helpful to have gangways that are lift up so that they don't block the light, or to build gangways that have light penetration through them. So two ways. There's many, many other ways. Of course, the ultimate one is to decrease both individually and collectively CO2 emissions. But on a day-to-day basis, when we get together and ask ourselves, what can we do? These are some of the things that we can do. And it's always the power of people talking to people, not necessarily conservation groups, but encouraging boaters to talk to each other, encouraging neighbors who live along the shoreline to talk to each other. That's where the information can be received sometimes more receptively, because it's not coming from outside, it's coming from people in their own community. That's my hope. Restoration takes many forms. Everything that we do on the land affects the ocean and vice versa. So from debris removals on the seabed to getting rid of ivy and creating spaces for food production, or putting in native plants, or restoring eelgrass, or the latest one I've heard is keeping dandelions in compacted soils, because those tap roots that dandelions form actually are very beneficial. I was listening to Alexandra Morton on a CBC interview a few weeks back, and she referred to those dandelion lovers and the eelgrass lovers and the, everybody who makes up the conservation movement are kind of part of the immune system of the earth. And I really liked that phrase. And I just remind everybody I talk to that there's millions and millions and millions of concerned people of all ages, all around the world, that are working towards making a difference. And the way to start, of course, is to educate ourselves and our children to pay attention, to show up, and try to do the best we can collectively. We need to stay connected, not only to nature, but to ourselves. We're a part of it, of course, but to stay connected, to keep these conversations going. And that's why I appreciate groups like the Sunshine Coast Conservation Association inviting me to do this, because it's not only me being able to show pretty pictures, but it gives us an opportunity to speak to each other about our concerns, about what's happening in the community that reverses the trends of degradation, and to give ourselves hope. So I really appreciate your time and attention, and I'm going to ask Richard what he found out. Are you there? Are you still looking?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Well, I dug away and I didn't really find anything. I've spent 5 minutes not knowing to miss too much of what you were saying and be distracted, but 5 minutes turned up nothing. There seems to be eelgrass. I've seen a few headlines here talking about eelgrass in the Baja, but nothing.
Interesting.
I guess I learned that there are different types of eelgrass around the world.
Yeah. Yes.
And so I don't know, maybe the conquistadors dug it all up. Who knows? I don't know why. And I Googled Chile and Argentina separately to see if there was any eelgrass references for Chile and Argentina. But
Okay. Well, I'll keep digging.
I don't know. Well, yes, I don't know how I'm going to sleep tonight now, but when I get a moment, I'll get back and see if I can track some more information down.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I had a question about that, and it was sort of along the lines of what Rick was thinking when he posed it. But my question was like, does the eelgrass like colder water better, or does it like certain types of nutrients and sediments? Like, can eelgrass grow along any shoreline on planet Earth, or are there places where it's like my roses like certain kinds of soil better than others?
So the eelgrass that I was referring to is Zostera marina, and it's native to this area. It's different than the Zostera japonica, which grows intertidally. They don't really compete, so I don't consider it an invasive plant. It's just exotic. It comes from Japan. So the marina has a range of temperature. It likes colder water in the range of the temperate areas. There are other seagrasses that can grow in the tropics that can tolerate much larger, higher temperatures. It's a really flexible plant. It can take very saline or very freshwater environments. But again, the optimal growth happens within a certain range. What is happening is that sort of the immune response is being threatened. So when I said it's a very flexible plant and it has a pretty large range, say for temperature, the higher the temperatures now in the shallow subtidal, which eventually affect the subtidal areas, the higher the temperatures, the more vulnerable the native eelgrass is to disease. And so there's a mold called labyrinthula which is always present. It's always like we have germs in our own bodies. And it's only when we're under incredible stress for a prolonged period of time that we succumb to those germs and they turn into disease or sickness. Same with sea stars, same with eelgrass. We've kind of violated their boundary for resisting a mold that's always present. When we look at eelgrass, you'll find little black streaks on the blades, and that's most likely the mold, unless the blade itself is naturally dying. But it's a streak. It's not the whole blade turning black and sloughing off, which it does naturally, but it's a streak. And as the temperatures rise, that mold kind of takes off. And I'm just finding a lot of species in the ocean are no longer able to resist those pathogens that are in the environment naturally because they're being stressed for too long a period of time. What's happening with higher temperatures as well is that the oxygen on the shallow end of the ocean is in less dense water than the water that is more dense and colder at the bottom. That's called stratification. If you're a diver or even a swimmer or whatever, you're a paddler and your boat tips, you know that it's pretty warm up above, and the more you go down to the bottom, it's very, very cold. Well, as temperature rises, that stratification gets less efficient. So there's less oxygen coming from the surface of the water and traveling down into the deeper ends. So there's less oxygen at depth than there normally was, all to do with temperature and climate change. So we are upsetting the natural balances of so much of what lives on this planet. And, you know, some people refer that as, oh, nature's being vengeful, you know, and we're projecting all this judgment upon which we're the recipients. But I don't think it's vengeance at all. I think it's trying to reach equilibrium again. And to reach equilibrium, sometimes some horrific things will happen just to find balance. And that's the stage that we're in now. So what can we do about eelgrass if we're going to be specific about that balance making? For me, I'm thinking about how can we lighten our impact? Boat anchoring off, boat mooring off. Let's take that weight off. Let's look at the kind of inputs we're putting into these bays and estuaries. And also let's examine what's happening on the shores so that eelgrass can move shoreward as sea level rise increases. So if we don't put walls up and we naturalize our shorelines as much as possible, and ultimately what we need to do is move our houses and our infrastructure back, because nature will have her way no matter how many walls we put up. If we're cognizant that this land-water connection is always a dynamic one, and that right now nature is in the favor of moving shoreward, then why don't we make that area as conducive to these plants as possible? So how can we make these migrating habitats coming to where we normally live? How can we say welcome? Seems like it's beyond our control. So let's okay, what do we do here? That was a long answer to a very simple question. I'm sorry.
It was brilliant, but I'm sorry if I monopolize. I promise to leave space for others, but I do need to just link this now to your answer. Totally segues back to a talk that we had a couple days ago from the District of Sechelt about development permit areas and how, you know, what we do on the foreshore really totally affects the ocean. And now you're bringing back the story of the big impacts for everything. So, and we had started a conversation with the staff at the district about, you know, how can we educate people and encourage and inspire people to do better with green shoring and that kind of thing. And we're kicking around ideas about, you know, how to have a communications and outreach thing or some kind of campaign together where we, you know, we like invite people to, it was like foreshore makeovers or something, you know, but like make it positive and show people how they can have a positive impact. So maybe if we do that, I will invite you again, Nikki, to be part of that conversation.
It's such an interesting conversation. There's a very obvious stick and there's a very obvious carrot, but the stick seems to win out with many. Well, it doesn't win out. It needs to be sharpened, if you will. I think that other areas of the world should be looked at around what kinds of regulations can control the kind of development that is continuing on this coast. So that's kind of the negative part, but the positive part, in a kind of funny way, is that economically it doesn't make sense. Economically, it will not make sense to build the hardest shoreline you can because they don't last. They don't last. It's a lot of investment in time and money, and the waves, as they get more and more forceful, will win out. So there's a lot to that conversation. I would love to be a part of it. Thank you. Oh, we're not depressed, are we? Not depressed? No.
I feel like you're a balm for my soul right now. I get really sad about this stuff a lot. I think a lot of people have those ebbs and flows, but I just feel like you're I don't know, you're weaving the connection and how we can make, we can do things that will help and be positive. And I really honestly, I feel so grateful to you, Nikki, for your thought, like the heart that you bring to this conversation that isn't, disconnected or just science focused, but it's really, I believe strongly that moving forward, especially after COVID, we've been so disconnected that, bringing it all back together and talking about this from the place of we are the earth, we're not separate from it, is what we need to heal each other and ourselves and the planet. So I hear that message from you. And Rick,
thank you, Suzanne. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Suzanne. Yes, I agree. It's the hope. I have a question, and Nikki would know, and Diane probably knows quite a bit too, and probably others. But so we live on our coastal climate here, and we know how important eelgrass and so many other features of our ecosystem are. To what extent are those, do those correlate with our school curriculum? Do they learn as much about these kinds of issues in Saskatoon as they do in Gibson's, or does our school curriculum include them somehow? Is there an emphasis in our science programs on local ecology?
I think Diane can speak very well about local community and curriculum, having been educated for decades.
Yeah, I can speak, Richard, definitely as to locally. Over the years of doing programming with schools, I found that teachers find where we are a natural resource, right? A natural resource for learning, especially in sciences, but also in language arts and, in many different aspects. So I would find that there were teachers that were more comfortable with taking classes out and others that were not. So that was one of the natural restrictions. As far as curriculum requirements, I think there's enough openness with the curriculums that they could make anything fit really that has a natural propensity. So what I'm saying is we have the oceans available to us everywhere and the shorelines available to us, so that, the teachers could say, okay, if I choose to fit this in with an ocean theme or a shoreline theme or a restoration theme, I can do it. But I think it boils down to a teacher's choice as to whether they do that or not. And as far as other provinces, I mean, if you look at the universities, it seems like a lot of our marine biologists come from Alberta or Saskatchewan. And it's interesting, like I've met over the years quite a few young and upcoming marine biologists, and they're not from British Columbia, and they're not from the coast. They're from somewhere like Saskatchewan or Guelph, in Toronto, or so it's interesting. It seems to be a universal fascination. I always think it's because of the ocean that we have in our blood, right? That salt content that our bodies have, it just draws us naturally to the ocean. That's just my sort of feeling on it. But that being said, there are, as far as curriculum, I'm afraid I don't know what Alberta or, Saskatchewan or Ontario have. I mean, East Coast, I'm sure that they would be experienced the same as we do. So the teachers would be using that natural resource that's there to, formulate their education. I mean, it's just a natural. It's just so simple to do. Yeah.
In Saskatchewan, they're studying slough ecology
Are they?
as well as estuary stuff, having been raised in Saskatchewan, and the migration of pelicans, and the way that the North Saskatchewan River breaks up in this, it's just all about whatever's local, and that really, and there's so much connection, as you've already we've been talking about today, between that and what happens in the ocean. But yes.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too. You talk about pelicans, right? And those pelicans end up on the coast.
Yes.
And so it depends. I think it really depends on the teachers as well, right? How much do they want to do taking that little picture out and further to the big picture?
So there is a pelican community in Saskatoon. Maybe I wasn't making that up.
No,
They live in
no, I know.
Saskatoon at the weir, and they go between Saskatoon and Red Lake, and then they migrate. And it's, so it's whatever's around.
Yeah.
There's a big connection there.
Oh, huge. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question? Leanne, there's Leanne.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, there were a couple of comments that I wanted to make. One of them was from my own experience of the Pacific shore from Washington State to California, is that the ocean is very, very rough, and that eelgrass in Oregon, anyway, I do know the only place I ever saw it was in estuaries. And there are a lot of those, but along the long beaches and rocky cliffs, I just can't imagine eelgrass hanging out around Big Sur. It just does not. However, up around the corner, there's some really nice estuaries.
there's a beautiful slough down there that
Yeah.
is doing well, as far as I know. I haven't been keeping in touch, but yeah, it's a beautiful slough with very successful eelgrass and a lot of research centered on it. There is a grass called surf grass. Have you seen that? It's very slender, very long.
No.
And as a diver, we were always conscious if surf grass was growing pretty abundantly on the shore, it's probably not a good place to dive because it's extremely resilient to storm waves. And on the California coast where I learned to dive,
Oh, those, yes,
you
that
can go
stuff.
down
Yeah.
and 40 or 60 feet and come up, and the conditions on the surface are completely different.
Totally different.
And I would have said to myself, if that's true, oh, well, I should have paid attention to surf grass. And it's there because it can really take those waves.
Right. I was just going to comment that being in Tofino for the last few days, I was seeing this stuff and I'm not really familiar with it at all, right? And so I saw all of these squid eggs that had hundreds that had washed up, but amongst it was this slender grass. And I realized, because you and I had this conversation before about this grass that I had seen, I think in one of Bob Turner's videos, and where it was growing on rocks. And so anyhow, I did see lots of residual bits of it all over the place. And yeah, so I thought, okay, that's got to be the seagrass we're talking about. Yeah. Interesting stuff. Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to comment on around on the coast is that we are missing big rivers and estuaries,
Right.
you know, and yet to me, I just made this giant connection with septic systems, because almost all of our septic systems and most housing is using septic.
Yeah.
Vast majority uses septic, and it all washes straight into the chuck,
Yeah.
although people don't realize it. So it's sort of like, I'm sort of imagining what various ways of making those connections for people, because we have so many new people here now and so many people from the city, and they don't even know they have a septic, never mind how to take care of it, or that it links to anything else, or that the shallow aquifers that are so abundant, not the deep ones, but just the surface ones. I mean, really, there's a lot of connections I think we could be doing there in terms of public education, for sure.
I agree.
Do we have time for a really quick story about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I walk frequently between my house and Flume Park because that's where I'm close to, down the hill. And I was walking one day and came across this horrid smell, chemical smell. I knew that it was some sort of a fuel. And so I started looking in the ditches, and sure enough, I saw this. I couldn't find a point source, but I could see this sheen going down the hill, heading down the ditch towards the park. And I knew that at that junction, that the drainage from the ditch went across and down to the beach at Bloom Park. And so I was pretty freaked out about that. So I went back up, looking around, trying to figure out where this came from. Couldn't find it. So I got on the phone. I phoned the fire department. I phoned as many different organizations as I could. Environment Canada did show up about 2-3 days later. But the fire department showed up right away, and they were saying what's the best thing to do. And I was suggesting that we get some bales of straw, and try and slow things down, which they were great about doing. They got stuff in really quickly. And then Environment Canada did eventually show up and put in some of the tubes, the barrier tubes, which was great. And then they investigated, and the source was a fuel tank. So the heating fuel tanks that people used to have outside their houses, apparently there's no check to see their condition. So this one had just ruptured and onto the soil and into the ditch. And boom, just causing havoc. Anyway, long story short is they had little signs posted, don't play in this water, in the park. And other than that, not much happened. I went back a few days later and started looking in the ditch, and I was finding hundreds, if not thousands, of wads of earthworms dead in the ditch. Just boom, 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 all the way down. And the little park where the ditch went across the road and down, there was a sheen there for probably, I want to say, up to a week. And it just happened. And there was, no other, what could I say? No other. I inquired with Environment Canada because I ran into them there when they were there and said to them, what are you doing about this? Is there regulation? Is there a check for these tanks, which we know are all quite common? They're not so common now, thank goodness. But at the time, were really common, and they were all about the same age, meaning that we had this time bomb, right? Just coming along, one after the other, just failing and just becoming part of the groundwater, and away it goes down to the ocean. Anyway, so long story short is we need to make sure, I think, that things are in place to prevent before disaster happens. If we can make sure that, like the District of Sechelt, looking at the shorelines, if they can sort of retroactively think back to what sources of problems there are that we have to look for. It would be just a wonderful world if we could do that.
And helping people. You remember when the district had the toilet replacement program? There
Yep.
was money, you could go, and it's the same for water catchment. You can go and you can get a subsidy. So if people who have those old tanks that are just sitting there,
Yep.
that maybe have some fuel left in them,
Yep.
We could
Yeah.
figure out if there's got to be a pot of money somewhere that the SERD or somebody could help people get rid of those in properly.
Yep, the Dead Tank Removal Society.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, you gave me the perfect segue there. That nice one, Diane.
That was great.
Yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up for today, and I just really wanted to say so much gratitude, Nikki, for coming and sharing with us, and for everybody for being in this conversation and you know, caring about these issues and trying to figure out ways we can all contribute. It's so great to be part of a community that, you know, is working hard to do these things and cares so much.
Mm.
And I need to acknowledge that the World Oceans Day event and the festival has been supported by the District of Sechelt with funding since we started 5 years ago. And we couldn't have done this without them. It's great to have the local government pitching in that way too. And this year we also got money from the credit union. So I think, you know, the more we get the message out and we're able to connect and share, the more we'll be supported in the community as well.
Mhm.
And that's the World Oceans Day Working Group is this really small group of volunteers, except for me, I'm staff, that includes Diane and Angela and some of our board members. And without you guys, this, you know, I would have no clue what to be doing around the World Oceans Day project. Like Diane and Angela have done so much work in this community for so long with the citizen science and education. I just, you know, huge hands up to you for everything you've done to support this. And then, of course, Billy. Billy has just worked so hard to do and Rise 'em Up Media and the Green Film Series to pull together the website and the film programming and the short films and bring in co-extinction. You know, this is a huge amount of work, and it's so important to have this aspect of the festival as well, because the films are a way, when it comes to oceans, not all of us are snorkeling or swimming or diving. I think having the films is just a really critical way for people to see what's under there and to fall in love with the oceans and to want to help. So just super grateful to Billy. And then I wanted to remind everybody that the films are going to be available, all of the films and the shorts, until the end of the day on June 10th. And not all of them will be available after that, but most of them will. So, you know, our hope is that the website becomes an ongoing resource for us to rally and connect and share these talks. And the next talk tomorrow will be John Rowe and the Dead Boat Removal Society. So that one's Thursday, June 9th, same time at noon. So I hope you guys, if you can, you'll come out. And I just really, really appreciate everybody and all the working together. And thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Thanks, guys.
Billy? You're muted.
Oh, Billy.
Mhm.
Still muted.
Here. We're going to, the Green Film Series is going to show co-extinction on either the 26th or the 27th at the Gibson's Playhouse. So we've got a little bit of time to promote that now and get that out there for people. So just
Good.
wanted to give everybody the good news.
Good news. Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Billy.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.